prairie stretched endless beneath the setting sun, golden light spilling across the tall grass that swayed like an ocean, the cicadas droning, the wind dry as bone. And yet the land was not silent, for somewhere far off a raven cried and its echo shivered across the plain, carrying with it a chill that did not belong to summer, a chill that followed Jack Mercer as he rode his tired mare along a cattle trail long abandoned, his eyes scanning the horizon for shelter before night came down hard and fast. And it was then, when the last red streak of daylight dipped below the hills, that he saw it, an old shack half collapsed, leaning like a drunk against the desert wind, its boards gray with rot, its door hanging open like a mouth too weary to close. And though he had passed dozens of such ruins in his wandering, something in the way this one sat, crouched low and waiting, pulled at him, and against his better judgment. Jack turned his horse toward it, dust curling beneath her hooves as the prairie seemed to hold its breath, and when he dismounted, boot heels sinking into dry earth, he heard it, the faintest sound, softer than a prayer, like fabric shifting against wood, like a muffled breath in the dark. And his hand went instinctively to the revolver at his side, his thumb brushing the worn steel as he stepped inside, the shack groaning under his weight, the smell of mildew and something copper thick in the air. And there in the far corner, tied to a post driven deep into the dirt floor, sat a figure, a woman, her dress torn and filthy, her arms bound cruelly behind her back with coarse rope, and over her head a burlap sack pulled tight, knotted at the throat so rough it left angry welts along her collarbone. And she stirred as he entered, a shudder running through her thin frame before she lifted, her face blindly toward him, her voice breaking in a whisper that cracked with fear. Please, please don't take them off. And though Jack's blood ran colder at the sound, though every instinct screamed that something was wrong, his boots carried him closer, his shadow falling across her as the last light bled from the doorway, and he muttered low and wary, "What in God's name happened to you, miss?" But she only shook her head beneath the sack, her voice urgent now, trembling. "Don't untie me. Don't pull it off. I'm begging you." And Jack, hardened by years on the trail, by gunfights and loneliness and the long silence of the desert, felt the hair rise at the back of his neck, because never in all his wandering had he heard a plea so full of terror, not of dying but of being freed. And as the prairie wind rattled the shack and the ropes creaked against the post, he realized he had stumbled upon something far stranger than any outlaw or storm, something that carried the weight of a secret the West itself had buried. Jack Mercer had seen plenty of strange things on the trail, men shot dead in duels who swore they saw angels, cattle wandering in circles for hours under a desert moon, a preacher in El Paso who claimed to raise the dead with nothing more than scripture and whiskey. But nothing in all his years of drifting, from town to town, gun at his hip and dust on his boots, had prepared him for the trembling woman bound to that post, her voice so brittle it seemed to splinter the air as she begged him not to untie her, not to lift the sack that hid her face. And yet as Jack stood there, the lantern light from the shack's broken window trembling against the burlap, his chest tightened with a war he knew too well, the battle between instinct and duty, between the gnawing itch of curiosity and the hard code of decency that every cowboy who called himself a man carried, like a brand upon his soul. And as much as he wanted to heed her plea, to leave her bound and ride away, another voice inside him whispered louder, "No woman deserves to be left this way." And though his gut twisted with unease, Jack drew his hunting knife from its sheath, the steel flashing dully in the shadows, and he crouched low, his voice firm but gentler than he expected. "Easy now, I ain't gonna hurt you. Just gonna cut you loose." And the woman shook so hard the ropes creaked, her muffled cry sharp as the desert wind. "No, please, please don't. You don't understand. They put me here for a reason." But Jack's blade slid quick and practiced, severing the first rope around her wrists, then the one binding her arms to the post, the hemp falling in coils at her feet like dead snakes. And for a heartbeat she slumped forward as though the weight of her own freedom crushed her. But when he reached for the knot at her neck, fingers brushing the coarse sackcloth, she jerked back, the sound that left her throat no longer just fear, but something deeper, something that made Jack's stomach lurch, sound like a prayer, strangled by dread, and yet his hand didn't stop. Couldn't stop, because some part of him had already crossed a line the moment his knife touched rope, and with one sharp tug the knot gave way, the sack loosening around her neck, and he pulled it free, tossing it aside, and in that instant the world seemed to tilt. the air inside the shack turning colder than a grave, for the face that lifted toward him was not the face of any woman he had ever seen. Her skin pale and too smooth, her eyes wide and black as if the pupils had devoured every trace of color, her mouth trembling but stretched in ways a mouth should not. And Jack staggered back, boots skidding on the dirt floor, his heart slamming against his ribs as a sick wave of dread surged through him. Because it wasn't just that she looked wrong, uncanny, unnatural. It was the feeling that poured from her like smoke, heavy, suffocating, a darkness that pressed against his lungs and whispered through the marrow of his bones. And before he could reach for his revolver, before he could even curse his own damn foolishness, she raised her head fully, her lips curling into a whisper that slid into his ears like venom. "I told you not to take them off." And with that, Jack Mercer, a man who had faced down outlaws and buried friends in the hard dirt of the frontier, stumbled back against the shack wall, his strength failing, his vision swimming with shadow. And for the first time in years, the cowboy collapsed, not from bullet or blade, but from fear so pure it hollowed him out, leaving him gasping on the floor as the woman, free now, stood above him in silence. The sack crumpled at her feet like a shed skin. Jack Mercer woke to the taste of iron in his mouth, his head pounding like a war drum, and for a long moment he lay in the dirt of that shack, unsure if he had passed into the world beyond or if hell itself had crept into his bones. But when his eyes cleared, the woman was gone, the rope scattered like shed vines, the sack lying crumpled and empty at his side, and the silence pressed down harder than gunfire, thick and wrong. And when he staggered to his feet, clutching the wall for balance, he realized the air itself seemed heavier, the night outside darker than it should have been, as though the stars had fled. And when he stepped out into the desert, he swore the land was different. The shapes of the mesquite twisted, the wind colder, carrying with it whispers that slithered through the brush like rattlesnakes. He called out for her, not even knowing why, maybe the same instinct that had made him untie her, but no voice answered. Only the long, low groan of the plains that felt more alive than dead. And as he mounted his horse, legs trembling, he tried to shake it off, tell himself it was exhaustion, a trick of the eyes, but the horse knew better. Its ears pinned back, its nostrils flaring, muscles quivering under the saddle as though it too had seen what he'd seen, and together they rode into the night. But no matter how far they went, the shadows seemed to follow, stretching longer, clutching at his boots like hands. And when he finally reached the trail toward Dry Creek, the nearest town, he found the first sign that whatever curse he had loosed was spreading, because the carcass of a steer lay across the path, eyes blackened, body shriveled as though every drop of life had been drained from it, and above it a circle burned into the earth, smoldering faintly, though no flame had touched it, and Jack's breath caught in his chest, for he had seen men shot, scalped, lynched, torn apart by wolves, but nothing like this. Nothing that whispered of a hunger older than bullets or blades. And as he pressed on, every fence post, every tree seemed to watch him. The sound of hooves muffled against the dirt like the land itself was swallowing noise, until at last the glow of Dry Creek flickered ahead, lanterns in windows promising the safety of whiskey and warm stoves. But when Jack entered, he found the saloon hushed, men staring at him as though he carried something foul on his shoulders. And when he sat down at the bar, trying to steady his shaking hands with a shot of rye, old Doc Halverson leaned in, eyes narrow, voice low. "Boy, you seen something out there, ain't you? I can smell it on you." Like grave dirt. And though Jack tried to laugh it off, his voice cracked, betraying the fear he couldn't shake. And that was when the doors swung open, wind rushing in though the night was still, and every man in the saloon turned as the woman walked in, her bare feet silent against the floorboards, her black eyes fixed on Jack, her pale skin gleaming, like moonlight on a coffin lid, and though no rope bound her now, every man felt the weight of her presence as if chains had been laid across their souls, and the piano player froze mid-note. The whiskey in Jack's hand slipped and shattered, and the woman's lips parted, her whisper curling through the smoke-thick air. "He freed me," and the room seemed to shudder as lantern flames guttered low. And Jack, heart pounding, realized with a sickness deep in his gut that this wasn't just about him. What he had unleashed would not stop at the shack, or the trail, or Dry Creek. It would bleed across the land like wildfire, and every man, woman, and child in its path would pay the price for the moment he ignored her plea and untied her in the dark. The saloon air grew so heavy, Jack thought the ceiling might collapse upon them, Though no board cracked nor beam shifted, it was simply the weight of her. The pale figure now standing at the threshold, with the sack that once bound her dangling, limp in her hand like a butcher's cloth, her black eyes reflecting the lamplight not with glimmer but with emptiness. And every man in Dry Creek who looked upon her swore later it felt as though their own shadows were trying to crawl away. But in that moment no one breathed, no one moved, except Jack Mercer, who rose from his seat, not by courage but because some current dragged him forward, his boots scraping against the floor, his mouth desert dry. And though his hand twitched toward the revolver at his hip, he knew deep in his bones a bullet would no more stop her than it would stop the wind. And as he stood face to face with her, the whisper left her lips again, softer now, almost tender. "I told you? Don't take them off." And she raised the sack, holding it between them as if daring him to touch it, to see the truth it carried. But before he could answer, the room itself seemed to turn against them, lanterns sputtering out one by one, piano strings snapping with sharp twangs that echoed like gunshots, and the men of the saloon staggered back, some clutching their heads as if invisible hands squeezed their skulls, others mumbling prayers as the air throbbed with a low hum that seemed to rise from the earth beneath their boots. Jack grabbed her arm then, not in anger but desperation, his voice breaking. "What are you?" "What did I set loose?" And for the first time her expression faltered, not cruel nor ghostly but sorrowful, and she leaned close enough he felt the chill radiate from her skin, whispering, "Not what? Who?" "They buried me with it, bound me so the hunger stayed locked away." "And you, cowboy, you tore the seal?" And Jack staggered back, bile burning his throat as the meaning cut through him. Whatever darkness stared at him through those black eyes was not just her curse. It was a prison she had been forced to carry, a vessel for something older than the towns that dotted the frontier, older than the tribes that roamed before, something bound with rope and sack and fear. And now, because of his knife, it walked free. Outside, horses screamed, their hooves clattering against cobblestones as if spooked by fire, and gunshots cracked in the distance though no target stood. And the sheriff burst through the swinging doors, rifle in hand, eyes locking on Jack first, then on the woman. And though his jaw stiffened, his fingers trembled on the trigger, because what he saw wasn't a woman at all, but a shadow moving inside her, stretching her frame like a puppet. And when the sheriff demanded she stop, raise her hands, leave the town, she only smiled, a crack in her face too wide for human lips, and whispered, "This land is mine again," before blowing out every flame in Dry Creek, with a single exhale that rolled through the town like winter wind, plunging the place into a darkness so pure the stars themselves seemed snuffed out. And Jack, heart pounding, realized he was no longer fighting for himself, but for every soul who'd ever called the frontier home. And yet in that same breath he knew the fight would not be against a woman, nor a ghost, but against something that wore her face as a mask. And every ounce of blood spilled from here on would trace back to the moment in that shack, when she had begged him not to take them off, and he, stubborn as any rancher with a knife, had ignored her warning. Dry Creek had always been a stubborn little town, clinging to the edge of the desert like a burr on a mule's hide, surviving drought, raids, and the kind of lawless cruelty that ate at weaker settlements. But what swept through it now was not something bullets nor whiskey, nor prayer could drive away. For the moment the last flame died and the darkness swallowed every corner. The townsfolk scattered like cattle before a storm, some running into the desert night screaming, some huddling in churches whispering broken prayers, some falling to their knees as shadows rose taller than men, moving without form yet heavy with intent. And Jack Mercer, still reeling from what he'd heard, found himself drawn not to flight, but toward the bell of the old mission church on the outskirts, a building abandoned decades ago. After fever took half the town and folks said its ground turned sour, but in Jack's mind a whisper insisted the answers waited there. And so he rode, his horse lathered and shaking, the road lined with figures he couldn't look at too long, twisted, outlines of men that dissolved when approached, hands reaching out from alleyways only to vanish into the dark. But he pressed on, his revolver heavy in his hand, though he knew it would do little, until at last the church rose from the black like the skeleton of a giant, its bell tower crooked, its doors half rotted, and inside the air thick with mildew and something sharper, the metallic bite of old blood. And there she was, the woman he had freed, kneeling before the altar where no cross stood, her hair hanging like a shroud, her back to him. And when he called her name, though he realized he didn't know it, she turned slowly, her face pale as bone, eyes swallowing the dim light, and her voice carried, not in the room but in his skull. They built this place for me, not for God but for prison. And as she spoke, images flooded his mind, of settlers binding her, forcing the sack over her head, ropes cutting into her skin, burying her alive beneath stone, chanting words older than scripture to lock the hunger she carried inside her flesh, a hunger she had not chosen but inherited, a curse that made her a vessel. And Jack fell to his knees as the vision scorched his thoughts, sweat pouring down his neck, because he understood now the sack had not been to humiliate her nor hide her shame. It had been the last lock on a door that should never have been opened, and by cutting the rope he had torn that lock free, releasing the hunger to roam untethered. And as he gasped for air, she leaned close, her whisper breaking into sobs. I begged them to kill me, I begged them to end it, but they made me carry it instead. And now you've loosed it, and it will not stop until it devours every living soul. And the ground beneath the church shook, dust raining from rafters as the walls trembled, and from the cracks in the floor rose shapes blacker than night, twisting, writhing, stretching into clawed silhouettes that moaned without mouths, reaching toward Jack, toward the woman, toward the world beyond. And in that moment Jack realized the reckoning had come, not a battle of gun smoke and lead, but of will and sacrifice. And if he did not find a way to end what he had unleashed, the frontier itself would become a graveyard without headstones, swallowed whole by the hunger of something too old to name. The church groaned like an old ship lost at sea, its rafters bending and splintering, as if some vast weight pressed down from the heavens. And Jack Mercer, revolver useless in his hand, realized he was standing not in a house of God, but in the heart of a cage meant to contain the uncontainable. And that cage was breaking, the cracks in the floor widening, shadows slithering through like floodwater, clawing up the pews, swallowing wood and stone with the patience of an endless hunger, while the woman, no, the vessel, fell to her knees before the altar, her body convulsing as if 1,000 hands pulled her skin in different directions, and her cries were not her own, but a chorus of voices layered over one another, men, women, children, old and young, all begging, cursing, weeping, their pleas mixing into a single howl that rattled Jack's soul. Yet beneath that storm, her own voice still trembled. End me, cowboy, before it takes all. And Jack's chest burned with the weight of his choice. For though he had lived by a code of grit and survival, nothing in all his years had prepared him for the burden of mercy. That meant destroying the very life he had tried to save. But the shadows surged higher, latching onto the beams, pulling the roof down in showers of dust. And he knew there was no time left for doubt, so he gripped the revolver, whispered a prayer he hadn't spoken since boyhood, and aimed at her heart. But before he could fire, she looked at him with eyes that flickered. Not black, but human, just for a breath. A flicker of the woman she had been, and she shook her head, whispering, not the bullet, the sack. And Jack's gaze snapped to the burlap lying torn upon the altar. Realization slamming through him like a hammer. The sack wasn't just a binding. It was the last vessel, the last tether strong enough to cage the hunger, and only by placing it back, by sealing her again, could the curse be bound. But it meant condemning her to a prison more terrible than death. And still, with shadows screaming and clawing toward the open desert beyond the church doors, Jack lunged forward, snatching the sack, the coarse fabric biting into his hands as if alive, and he forced it over her head while she wept, her body thrashing until at last the moment it slipped into place. The wailing voices cut short, the shadows recoiled with shrieks like burned animals, and the church fell silent save for the ringing in Jack's ears. Dust floated through the still air, the cracked floor sealed shut, the darkness drawn back inside her frame, leaving only a trembling figure bound once more by burlap and rope, and Jack collapsed beside her, his lungs raw, his soul torn. For though the hunger was sealed again, it came at the cost of her freedom, her humanity, and perhaps his own. Because when he rose at dawn and stepped into the quiet desert light, the sack still held, but her muffled sobs echoed behind him like a wound that would never heal, and he knew the curse wasn't gone, only waiting, bound by the brittle fabric of mercy, and it would take just one more fool with a knife and a conscience to tear the world open all over again. Jack saddled his horse, the sun bleeding red across the horizon, and he rode away not as a hero, but as a man carrying a burden heavier than chains, a secret he could never speak. And as he disappeared down the trail, the empty windows of Dry Creek watched him like eyes, knowing their fate rested on his silence. And partner, if this tale gripped your heart, If it made you feel the weight of fear, sacrifice, and the haunting choices that built the Wild West, then don't write off just yet. Hit that subscribe button. Join this trail of stories and keep the fire burning for more legends of the frontier. Because some tales, like the one Jack Mercer carried, are too heavy for one soul to bear alone.